In 1945, the United States stood on top of a smoldering pile of fascism and declared victory. And at the time, it felt like moral clarity itself, good versus evil, settled once and for all. The whole world watched as the guys in white hats punched the Nazis in the face and said, "Never again." But then, quietly, carefully, and with a whole lot of paperwork, the United States did something that didn't quite fit that story. They invited some of those Nazis to come live in America. Now, before you start crafting your comment about how this sounds like tinfoil hat territory, let me stop you, because this isn't conspiracy and it isn't speculation. It's documented US policy. It had a name, it had a budget, and it had a filing system, which is why the paper trail exists in the first place. The government itself created it. Here's the thing. Victory in World War II felt pretty damn clear at the time, but behind closed doors, there was already a new war brewing. It wasn't a shooting war, not yet, but it was a race for knowledge, a race for weapons, a race for the future. And in that race, the rulebook started looking less like law and more like a suggestion pamphlet. That's why by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why it happened, who approved it, how they pulled it off, and what had to be hidden, legally, carefully, and permanently to make it work. Picture this, it's spring 1945, and the war in Europe is in its final act. Allied forces are pushing into Germany from both sides like a slowly closing fist, with the Soviets advancing from the east and the Americans, British, and everyone else driving in from the west, while the Third Reich collapses in real time and everyone knows it's over. But what they didn't expect was what they found along the way. Because as American and British troops rolled through German territory, they started stumbling onto things that made their jaws hit the floor. Underground rocket factories carved straight into mountains, jet aircraft that made Allied planes look like crop dusters, guided missiles, supersonic wind tunnels, and weapons programs so advanced they felt closer to science fiction than reality. The Nazis, for all their catastrophic moral failures, had built genuinely terrifying technology, and it was exactly the kind of technology that could win the next war, whatever that war ended up looking like. And at the exact same time, the Soviets were discovering the very same things on their side of the line, which is where things got spicy. The war wasn't even officially over yet, but already both sides were scrambling to grab every German scientist, engineer, and technician they could get their hands on. Because this wasn't cleanup and it wasn't reconstruction, it was a heist. Two superpowers in waiting were racing through the rubble, stuffing brains into briefcases, and while the British were in on it too with their own programs, the main event was clearly shaping up to be America versus the Soviet Union, and neither side had any interest in playing fair. You had US intelligence officers driving through bombed-out cities with lists of names, trying to find rocket engineers before the Red Army did, and sometimes they got there first, but sometimes they didn't, and when they didn't, they knew exactly what that meant. Those scientists would be building weapons for someone else. Because of that, almost immediately this stopped being about justice and accountability and became about one thing alone: who gets the advantage. The war against fascism was ending, but the war for the future had already begun. And in that context, morality started getting flexible. All right, but hold on. Let's not pretend there weren't rules, because there absolutely were. And they were very clear, very official, and very public. After the war, the Allies implemented something called denazification. And it wasn't just a slogan or a PR campaign. It was actual policy with real consequences and real teeth. The idea was simple. If you're going to rebuild Germany, you need to make damn sure the people in charge aren't the same people who just tried to conquer Europe and exterminate entire populations. So the rules were laid out in plain terms. No Nazi party members in positions of authority, no SS members, period, no one who had demonstrated ideological loyalty to the Third Reich, no one who had participated in war crimes, and no one who had held significant rank in the regime. And this didn't apply to just one corner of society. It applied across the board, to government positions, to academia, to industry, and absolutely without question to anyone being considered for immigration or collaboration with the United States. This wasn't symbolic and it wasn't optional. This was the baseline. The American public believed this because they were told to believe it, that the rule was ironclad. You fought the Nazis? Great. You beat the Nazis? Even better. Now you were going to make sure none of them got to waltz into American society like nothing had happened. The messaging was consistent and deliberate. We won because we were the good guys, and good guys don't invite the bad guys to dinner. On paper, denazification was the moral foundation of the entire post-war order, the line that was never supposed to be crossed. So let's talk about Operation Paperclip, because you've probably heard the name before, maybe in a documentary, maybe in a meme, maybe from that one guy at a party who won't shut up about government conspiracies. But here's what it actually was. No drama, just the facts. Operation Paperclip was a program run by the United States government, specifically through the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, and its purpose was to identify, recruit, and relocate German scientists and engineers to America after World War II. These weren't random technicians, we're talking about specialists in rocketry, aerospace, medical medicine, chemical weapons, physics, electronics, basically anyone with a brain full of advanced German engineering and a willingness to point out American problems instead of German ones. The process itself was methodical. First, U.S. intelligence teams compiled lists of valuable personnel based on their expertise and potential usefulness to American military and industrial programs. Then, those scientists were evaluated, interviewed, and recruited, often with offers that went far beyond simple employment. Full relocation packages, bring your family, bring your notes, and we'll take care of the rest. After that came immigration, where scientists and their families were brought into the United States under special provisions that bypassed normal channels before being placed into military research facilities, aerospace companies, universities, and government labs. And this wasn't some rogue operation run by a handful of cowboys acting on impulse. It was coordinated at the highest levels, fully funded, formally approved, and supported by organizational charts and reporting structures like any other government program. By the time it wound down, more than 1,600 German specialists had been brought to America. 1,600 people who went on to work on missiles, jets, space exploration, and weapons systems that would define the Cold War, with some becoming household names, while others vanished into classified programs and never resurfaced. When you actually stop and sit with it, the scale is staggering because this wasn't a handful of carefully vetted exceptions, it was a pipeline, and this is where the problem really begins. Let's be clear about something before we go any further, because not every German scientist brought to America was a war criminal, and not every one of them was a true believer in Nazi ideology. Some were simply engineers who happened to live in Germany at a really bad time to live in Germany, but many of them were not that, and that distinction matters. A significant number of the scientists recruited under Operation Paperclip had direct ties to the Nazi regime, including Nazi Party membership, SS ranks, direct involvement in weapons programs that relied on forced labor, and even participation in research conducted on concentration camp prisoners. This wasn't rumor, and it wasn't something uncovered decades later by historians digging through dusty archives. It was known at the time. American intelligence officers knew exactly who they were recruiting. They had the files, they had the records, and they made those choices anyway. And this is where Wernher von Braun becomes impossible to ignore, not because he represents the entire story, but because he's the most visible example of it. Von Braun was a rocket engineer, a brilliant one, who led the development of the V-2 rocket for Nazi Germany, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, a weapon that killed thousands of civilians in Britain and Belgium, even though the production of those rockets killed far more. The V-2 was built at a place called Mittelwerk, an underground factory carved into a mountain where the workforce consisted of prisoners pulled from the Dachau concentration camp system and forced into labor, with thousands dying from exhaustion, starvation, beatings, and executions. Von Braun held SS rank, he visited the factory, and he knew exactly where his workforce came from. Yet, after the war, he was brought to America, given a laboratory, and eventually became one of the most celebrated figures in the US space program, helping put Americans on the moon. That's the tension, that's the contradiction, and that's the thing they couldn't ignore, but chose to work around anyway, because the real question was never whether these scientists had problematic histories, but whether those histories mattered more than what they could build, and apparently they didn't. Okay, here's the part where people usually get confused. So let's slow down and be very precise about what actually happened. Because when we say the US government rewrote the records of Nazi scientists, we're not talking about spy movie theatrics. Nobody was forging documents in a basement, nobody was creating fake identities with wax seals and invisible ink. What happened instead was far more subtle, far more bureaucratic, and honestly far more effective. Because the manipulation took place at the level of presentation. When a German scientist was evaluated for immigration to the United States, a file had to be compiled. And that file included their professional history, wartime activities, political affiliations, and an assessment of character. But the key detail is that the people compiling those files were often the same people who wanted those scientists in the country in the first place. So what they did was shape how the information appeared. First, through selective omission, where Nazi Party membership might technically be mentioned but buried, SS rank might be noted in an appendix no one would read, and direct involvement in forced labor programs could be summarized as having supervised wartime production, without explaining what that actually meant. Then came language laundering, where phrases were carefully chosen to obscure reality. Participated in wartime research could mean almost anything, and held administrative position in government-affiliated program could hide a lot of blood, with the goal being to keep the file technically accurate while ensuring that anyone skimming it walked away with a sanitized impression. After that came file reclassification, where the most damning documents were classified at levels that made them inaccessible to immigration officials, and if the worst information was locked in a vault the decision-makers couldn't open, then for practical purposes it didn't exist. And this worked because immigration decisions are made by human beings reading summaries, not by people cross-referencing SS rosters with a magnifying glass. Most are reading the first page, maybe the second, trusting the recommendation of the intelligence agency and assuming the file was compiled honestly. When you control what appears on that first page, you control the outcome, which is why this was never about creating outright lies, but about controlling which version of the truth was visible, something that in a bureaucracy is almost the same thing. The records weren't forged, they were curated, and that curation had one clear purpose: to make sure the scientists got in. Put another way, if you've ever written a resume, you already understand the game. You emphasize the good, downplay the bad, and use vague language where precision would hurt you. Except here, it was the US government doing that for rocket scientists with SS memberships, which meant much higher stakes. The result was that men who would have been barred under any honest reading of denazification policy sailed through the immigration process with clean-looking files and fresh starts in America, and the people who made that happen weren't rogue agents at all, but functionaries operating inside a system specifically designed to produce exactly that outcome. So now we arrive at the question you've probably been screaming in your head for the last few minutes: who the hell approved this? To answer that, we have to start at the top, because Harry S. Truman was President of the United States while Operation Paperclip was running, and in September 1946, he issued an explicit order stating that no one could be brought into the country who had been a member of the Nazi Party or who had been more than a nominal participant in its activities, no one who could be described as an ardent Nazi. On its face, that seems pretty clear. No Nazis. Simple. But policy only works if someone enforces it, and the people responsible for enforcement were the same people who very much wanted those scientists. That's where the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, or JIOA, enters the picture, because they were the ones running Paperclip on the ground, tasked with identifying scientists, evaluating them, compiling their files, and shepherding them through the immigration process. And when they encountered scientists with problematic backgrounds, which happened a lot, they faced a choice. They could flag the issues, report them honestly, and let the chips fall where they might, or they could massage the situation, and it's not hard to guess which option they chose. The JIOA routinely amended files to minimize Nazi affiliations, reclassified damaging documents, and wrote cover letters that emphasized scientific value while glossing over political and moral baggage. And in some cases, they even argued outright that the restrictions themselves were too strict and should be ignored. And the crucial point is that nobody stopped them, not because of some grand conspiracy of silence, but because of how bureaucracies actually function. Responsibility was diffused. Nobody was technically lying, they were just presenting information selectively. And nobody was technically violating policy, they were simply interpreting it creatively. When decision-making is spread across enough desks, no one feels personally responsible for the final outcome. The JIOA could say they were just compiling files, immigration officials could say they were just following recommendations, the military could say they were just accepting personnel, and the White House could say it didn't know the details, which meant everyone could sleep at night. This wasn't policy collapse, it was policy drift. The rules stayed on the books, enforcement quietly slid in a different direction, and by the time anyone with real authority might have objected, the scientists were already in the country, already working, and already too valuable to send away. There was no single villain here, no mustache-twirling mastermind saying, "Bring me the Nazis," just a system doing what systems tend to do when incentives point in one direction and rules point in another. Let's get into the why, because you're probably sitting there thinking, okay, they did this, but why? Why would the country that just spent 4 years and hundreds of thousands of lives defeating fascism turn around and recruit from the losing team? The answer breaks down into three categories, and none of them are pretty. First, there was Cold War urgency, because the Soviet Union wasn't a theoretical threat. By 1946 and 1947, the outlines of the Cold War were already visible. The Soviets had their own German scientists, and they were building rockets, jets, and weapons programs of their own. American military planners looked at that situation and saw a brutally simple equation. If we don't get these scientists, they do. And if they do, we fall behind. And if we fall behind, the next war might not end with our flag on the victory stand. This wasn't abstract fear. The people making these decisions genuinely believed American security depended on winning the technology race, and once the problem was framed that way, moral considerations became secondary, which meant accountability, justice for victims, and the message that participation in atrocities has consequences were all traded away for a better rocket engine. Second came technological acceleration, because the scientists being recruited weren't just useful, they were years ahead of anything the United States had, and German rocketry, jet propulsion, and guided missile technology would have taken American engineers a decade to replicate independently. By importing the people who already knew how to build it, the US leapfrogged the timeline, turning the V-2 program into the foundation of American missile development, feeding German aerospace research directly into jet fighter programs, and even using medical research, some of it conducted in horrifying ways, to inform aviation medicine and space physiology. The logic was brutal but coherent. Either build it yourself slowly or bring in the people who already built it for someone else, because speed wins. Even though the cost was that every scientist given a clean slate was a scientist who never faced consequences, and every victim of those programs was implicitly told their suffering mattered less than the next contract. And third, there was narrative control. Because if you're going to bring over more than 1,000 German scientists, you need a story that makes it acceptable, one that doesn't include phrases like SS officer or forced labor, which is why these men became German specialists instead of Nazis, apolitical engineers instead of ideologues, and people we were supposedly rescuing from the Soviets rather than individuals we needed regardless of their past. That story was sanitized before it ever reached the public, and that sanitization wasn't accidental, it was part of the plan, and the cost was truth, historical memory, and the principle that the public has a right to know what its government does in its name. 3 motivations, 3 costs, and not a single one of them makes the final result any less troubling. So what did the American people actually know about all of this? The short answer is almost nothing, and the longer answer is that they knew exactly what they were allowed to know, which was a carefully constructed version of events designed to avoid the obvious questions. When Operation Paperclip scientists appeared in public, and some of them did, especially those working on high-profile programs, the framing was always the same. These men were experts, they were helping America, they were contributing to national defense and scientific progress, and they had been rescued from the chaos of post-war Germany, or even better, saved from falling into Soviet hands. What was never mentioned were Nazi party memberships, SS affiliations, wartime activities, forced labor, or concentration camp connections. Any of it. The media didn't dig, partly because of the era, when investigative journalism existed but wasn't what it would later become, partly because of access, since many of these scientists worked on classified programs reporters couldn't get near, and partly because nobody was really asking the hard questions. Academia stayed quiet too, because scientists who collaborated with Operation Paperclip personnel didn't raise flags, universities that hired them didn't investigate backgrounds, and the entire system operated on a kind of mutual agreement not to look too closely. And that matters because silence is a choice. Every newspaper that ran a puff piece about rocket scientists without mentioning where they came from made a choice. Every university that accepted a researcher without questioning their CV made a choice. And every government official who signed off on a sanitized file made a choice. None of them explicitly said, "We know they were Nazis and we don't care," but they also didn't say, "Wait, shouldn't we check on this?" And that silence wasn't passive, but active, maintained, and sustained for decades. For most of the Cold War, the American public believed exactly what they were told, that the scientists building their missiles and exploring space were brilliant men who happened to be German, and that was really all there was to it, while the truth sat quietly in classified files, waiting for someone to care enough to open them. The silence didn't last forever, because by the 1970s, things began to shift as declassification programs started releasing documents that had been locked away for decades, and investigative journalists, the kind who actually read through boxes of government files, began pulling on loose threads. What they found was exactly what you'd expect by now: records showing that American officials knew about Nazi affiliations and processed scientists anyway, memos discussing how to handle ardent Nazis who were simply too valuable to reject, and files that had been altered, reclassified, or selectively summarized to smooth the immigration process. Books were written, articles were published, and congressional inquiries were held, and the picture that emerged wasn't ambiguous, it was damning. In the 1980s, the Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations began investigating suspected Nazi war criminals living in the United States, some of whom had come through Operation Paperclip, which led to a handful being stripped of citizenship, some deported, and others dying before any action could be taken. But historical revelation rarely changes what actually happened, and by then the Cold War was ending, the rockets had already been built, the moon had already been walked on, and the scientists had lived out their careers, raised families, and in many cases died peacefully. The truth didn't undo any of it, it simply changed how we understand it, confirming what many had suspected for years, that the moral clarity of the post-war period was, at least in part, a performance, and that behind the scenes, decisions were being made that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with advantage. At the same time, it validated the victims, the people who had suffered under these scientists' wartime work and had been implicitly told that their suffering mattered less than rocket fuel, because while the truth didn't change the outcome, it did change the story, and sometimes that matters.